everyone, and welcome to the second session of the Enhancing Cyber Supply Chain Assurance webinar series. I'm Mona Harrington, the Assistant Director of CISA's National Risk Management Center and the Government Co-Chair of the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, or for short, ICT SCRM Task Force. For those new to the task force, it's a significant public-private partnership with over 60 member organizations and nearly 300 participants from the US government and communications and IT sectors. This collaboration is truly a cornerstone of our efforts to strengthen and secure the ICT supply chain by addressing key challenges and developing solutions together. We are absolutely thrilled to celebrate the task force's 5th anniversary and proud of the tools, reports, and resources it has generated to bolster ICT supply chain resilience. As you may all know, in August, the ICT SCRM Task Force released the Software Acquisition Guide for Government Enterprise Consumers, Software Assurance in the Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management Lifecycle, or simply the Software Acquisition Guide. The guide outlines essential software security practices across the lifecycle, helping to ensure software assurance from design and development to deployment and operational use. Alongside the guide, we've included a detailed spreadsheet with CISA's Secure by Demand principles and a robust set of questions to help evaluate third-party software, providing clarity and direction without requiring acquisition teams to have deep cyber security expertise. Today's how-to session will walk you through practical examples of how to leverage the guide and accompanying spreadsheet step by step. We invite you to make this a conversation. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go along, and our expert panelists will also highlight how the guide aligns with CISA's Secure by Demand principles, the Secure Software Development Attestation Form, and SBOM standards, really giving a complete picture of how these resources support secure software procurement. We are excited to share more about the guide's benefits and show how it serves as a reliable, easy-to-use resource for procurement and acquisition teams across the government. Before I hand things over to our wonderful moderator, I want to extend a sincere thank you to the dedicated government and industry professionals who collaborated to bring the Software Acquisition Guide to fruition. And for your convenience, this will be recorded for future viewing. And now I'll pass it over to Joe, who will be leading today's discussion. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, A.D. Harrington. You know, it's really been a pleasure to be co-chairing this activity because of so many great contributions from both industry and government. And today I'm joined with panelists who were actively engaged in the development and the whole collaboration effort in our software acquisition group that we had. The panelists that I'm joined by are Dick Brooks, who's the co-founder and lead software engineer with Business Cyber Guardian, John Amos, supply chain risk management expert. He's with LMI. John and I've known each other for many years, even prior to that. And Sridhar Balasubramanian, who's also the principal product security architect at NetApp. And my other co-chair is Tim Mackey, who's the head of software supply chain risk management at Black Duck Software. I have to say, it's kind of amazing that we've gotten so much interest in this. If you just look at the number of website clicks on the CISA website, for the guide itself, we've had over 8,400 downloads. And the spreadsheet that goes with it, which is what people use to answer the questions, there's been over 4,000 downloads. So there is interest in this, and we understand that people want to know how can they use this better, how can it be helpful for what they're trying to deal with. And by the way, this is not just for government acquisition and procurement side of the house, and certainly they're the main users of it, but it's really for suppliers to get a handle on what is the government interested in making sure that they're actually receiving more secure products. So we'll start off with our questions here. And we'll mainly go into the software acquisition guide usability. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and answer the question about what the guide is and how it can be easily used. I'll start off with Tim, who is the co-chair of this. Tim, what's your perspective on the usability of this document?
So thank you, Joe. Just a touch of background for me, I've been in this particular software supply chain risk management role for a few years now. Actually came into Black Duck as part of its original acquisition into Synopsys, and now we're spun out again as an independent entity. This is a fantastic guide. If you were to sit down and let's say read all 60 something pages of it, it's actually a pretty solid read, but that's not usability. That's not really where it's at. The guide itself is trying to fundamentally answer one key question. Is the software that I'm acquiring, whether that's purchase of software, purchase of a software-enabled thing, actually developed in a manner that is consistent with the security expectations that I have? And for most organizations that are in the software supplier side, as Black Duck is, we routinely receive requests for information, requests for proposals that have a whole litany of security-related and governance questions around how we went about developing that software. Very much free-form material. The problem with that philosophy is that while it might be relatively unique to someone who is, say, asking the same questions over and over again to the same organization, as a recipient of that form, I'm left with a real challenge. How do I answer compound questions? How do I actually interpret the meaning? What we did with the software acquisition guide is simplify things. The answers are simple, yes or no. There's no specific requirement for the evidence for that yes statement to be provided at this point in time. Context can be applied later, and this allows for baselining and benchmarking of vendors and their practices against what the expectations are for that particular piece of software or equipment as they move forward.
Okay, so how about others? So let's go next to John. Give your perspectives on this. And I'll tell you, I've known John since he was with Dell, and he dealt a lot with government procurement people. So he's got a bit of a background on this as well. John?
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks again to CISA and the task force for inviting me to participate on the panel and really to continue enabling meaningful public-private collaboration on how to improve ICT SCRM, which then immediately enables the improvement of cybersecurity across the government and industry as well. So as Joe mentioned, my name's John Amos. Most of my career has been focused on supply chain and logistics. I've specifically been focused on cyber supply chain risk management for almost 15 years now, when I was still with Dell. I am currently a principal at LMI, and for the last several years, I've been primarily supporting U.S. Agency for International Development, their CIO's team, by leading the development and maturation of their ICT SCRM program. So really, I'm coming in with more of the perspective, looking at it from the government agency standpoint, and really understanding that one of the biggest challenges in addressing ICT SCRM for a federal agency is it really does require knowledge and expertise in several unique and complex domains: cybersecurity, acquisition, contracting, operations, legal, counterintelligence, a bunch of others. Procurement professionals, specifically in the government, have had plenty to learn and understand themselves just about the acquisition process and contracting. This guide and the approach that was used will really be helpful to those procurement officials because they can readily understand yes and no responses to a fairly comprehensive list of questions that can really help focus the attention on potential gaps or vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. We will absolutely go into more details over the course of the webinar, but ultimately this guide will help the acquisition team quickly identify areas where potential suppliers and providers will either require additional attention or mitigation prior to acquiring their product or service, as well as identifying responses that may exclude particular suppliers from being selected for a particular use case.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. And Sridhar, I'm going to go to you next. Tell everyone, Sridhar had a major effort in helping with taking the NIST Secure Software Development Framework and helping to construct the guide in a way that was aligned with that, but organized that was important to us. So Sridhar, maybe give some of your perspectives on the guide and the accompanying spreadsheet.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thank you for CISA and also the task force for inviting me to participate in the panel. And thanks to all the participants for making it to this webinar. It's going to be pretty useful for all the people. And as evidenced by the number of downloads that Joe mentioned, that this has really piqued extreme interest. Coming from enterprise storage background, we constantly deal with third-party vendors, contract manufacturers. How do you assess the security practices in their environment is part of the risk factor that we handle all the time. So prior to entering into this task force work, what I was leveraging heavily was, as Joe pointed out, NIST SPI 161 used to be the bread and butter for me. So I created an initiative for supply chain security assessment within NetApp. Well, 7 years ago, and then ever since that, it became very useful and very powerful tool for us to gauge the suppliers before even onboarding them, and also ongoing basis to evaluate the risk management. But all these things I created in a manual basis because the questions are not pretty straightforward when you work with the guidance document. So I had to create conditional questions and also create several rounds of the survey. And so it was a nightmare for me to work with that. But coming from that background, this was really a pleasant way of, creating this guide and also the accompanying companion spreadsheet to make the job much more easier for anyone responding to these questions, and also being able to completely assess the security aspects and the risk aspects of the supplier, what they are up to in their environment. So this is going to be a very powerful tool for most of the vendors, not only from the point of view of supply chain security, but also from M&A perspective. If you are in the mode of acquiring other organizations as part of your business continuity plan, this would also provide a means for you to assess the security aspects in their environment before you make an intelligent decision about an acquisition as well.
That's excellent. The whole due diligence for M&A is an important use of this tool that we'd never really discussed prior to that, but it's definitely very applicable. Then the other individual I'm going to end with for just self-introductions here is Dick, to kind of talk about a breakdown of the guide. And Dick's going to get into a lot more details. And I have to really thank Dick's involvement in our group, bringing a sense from a small, medium size enterprise software development shop that says, how useful is this, and make sure that it was usable by a small company. So you've been very helpful in this team to be able to help with this. So Dick, kind of share some of your perspectives with this on the guide.
Thank you, Joe. And I have to thank you and Tim for your leadership in this. You guys really helped quarterback this right through the process. And of course, Sabine for bringing it through the CISA process of getting it out and published. And of course, all of the task force and ICT SCRM folks at CISA. So I'm Dick Brooks. I'm a co-founder of Business Cyber Guardian, and I'm responsible for all of the software products and services from the company. We work almost exclusively on the consumer side to provide cyber detection capabilities for the supply chain, and following secure by design and mainly SPA 161 requirements. As Joe said, my role is to be a participant and contributor as a small software producer who would have to respond to these expectations from CISA and U.S. government for secure by design products and the practices that go into making those products secure. So I will go into the specific categories in a little bit. There are 5 categories of controls that are covered, and I'll be addressing all of those in a few minutes. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dick. So let's get into a little bit more of the details here. And I'm going to start with John, mainly because John's had many years of dealing with government procurement acquisition professionals. And so from an agency perspective, could you elaborate on how procurement officials should use our software acquisition guide, and what are some of the minimum evaluation criteria that they should consider?
Absolutely.
We'll put up the next slide.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So yeah, this guide is truly intended for the acquisition team to really be able to efficiently expand the amount of information that they can receive and process about the practices and controls used by developers in the supply chain beyond those called out specifically by the secure development attestation form, which you see on the diagram. That self-attestation form has received a lot of attention over the last few years. It is a subset of what is found in the NIST SP 800-218, also known as the SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework. And everything within that document is contained within the software acquisition guide, but there's other areas that are not covered specifically in the SSDF that are also within the software acquisition guide. You can also see how there's overlap between what's in 800-161 as well as 853 and FedRAMP and many other different standards and guidelines and sets of requirements that are out there that are all focused on cybersecurity. There's not a single one that covers everything. So really the goal of this software acquisition guide is to go one step beyond what is in 800-218, but it's not something that's going to completely replace, for instance, 800-161. So the guide takes into consideration some of those other types of controls that in some cases may actually be the difference between mission success and failure, or even life and death. In my opinion, the guide today is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all to be used every time in its entirety by every acquisition team for every acquisition. But it is a really good attempt to provide a streamlined way to identify potential risks that are then deemed to be of concern to the acquisition team. NIST has done a great job in 161 describing how an acquisition team for an ICT project or program should be formed with key stakeholders from different disciplines and how they should use a risk-based approach to their decision making. The guide covers a very wide breadth of controls related to software development lifecycle, but the acquisition team really needs to start with that clear understanding and articulation of the criticality and the need for the software. Software really is ubiquitous. It is truly everywhere. It is well beyond just the operating system, the applications on your laptop or your phone. It includes firmware, BIOS, device drivers. It's in cars, airplanes, refrigerators, thermostats, doorbells, conveyor systems, machinery, medical devices. Software is everywhere in the American society today. And if you think of how closely tied to cybersecurity, information security that software can be, you understand that the development of software can directly impact confidentiality, integrity and availability of information, of the associated components, devices, networks, systems, and enterprises. So to try to answer the question, does an acquisition team need to require all of these questions to be fully answered for every single piece of software that may be used by every agency? Probably not. But should the agency consider the relevance of those questions to national defense systems, critical systems, high-value assets? Absolutely, yes. What is the software controlling? What's it connected to? What type of data is being processed by the software? What would be the impact if the confidentiality, integrity, or availability is compromised? Is it life or death? Would it result in grave danger? All of those things can impact it. Refrigerators and thermostats are not all created equal. Their uses don't have the same level of criticality. The refrigerator in my garage that I only use to keep a few beverages cool does not compare to the criticality of a refrigerator used to store temperature sensitive medical or biochemical products or something like that, or thermostats. There's a wide range of uses of those, just like a graphics card firmware that controls a monitor. Is it for a gaming console or is it for a fighter jet? So this guide can be really used as an efficient shortcut to ensure that the acquisition team addresses areas with the greatest risk to the enterprise and that their missions. The guide casts, as I mentioned, a very wide net into several different disciplines SSDF doesn't cover, so it should be beneficial to acquisition teams to help identify and prioritize opportunities for improvement or to mitigate specific risks or to make expectations really clear for suppliers. So the guide is intended to help procurement officials and the acquisition teams make informed, risk-based decisions. It will serve as a reference for best practices and standards in procurement. it was written in such a way that can be used with limited resources. These are all yes/no questions. They don't require interpretation of, paragraph responses where bidders can use soft wording that can kind of be legally or technically interpreted in different ways that could ultimately cause harm to the buyer. The guide is really a great way to have conversations internally within your agency with CIOs and CISOs, with the contracting officers, the cores, operators and maintainers, all of the key stakeholders. And you don't need to use the entire document for every solicitation, but it can definitely help strengthen the agency's security posture, help guide providers and developers and integrators, suppliers of all kinds to improve their current practices, so that together we can raise the bar, making it harder for nefarious actors to breach confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a system or a device through its software.
So it does cover a lot. And the best part about this, you don't have to be a cybersecurity expert when you're on the procurement team, but by using the guide, it really helps acquisition contracting officers to go and talk with their CIOs, the CISOs, the enterprise risk owners, to have that conversation, because it provides that right language there. So going into the other, and using this slide right here, Tim, I'm going to ask you, we know that the self-attestation form is out there now. That's actually covered by the Federal Acquisition Regulation. We know the evolving language with SBOM is out there, but we know that the guide also covers more things. So kind of share your perspective about what this is in the context of what the guide adds beyond what's currently in the law. It says minimum requirements like the attestation form.
You hit on like the most important word right there, Joe: minimum requirements. So a minimum set of requirements are not going to be satisfactory for every software procurement scenario. They're not going to be satisfactory for the scope of any particular mission. They are, by definition, the minimum set of requirements. Now, if we take a look at the CISA Secure Software Development Self-Attestation Form, it is itself a subset of a specific set of activities that are in NIST 800-218. And we see that in the Venn diagram here. One of the key elements is that the attestation form doesn't tell you anything about, for example, how that software could, should, or is deployed. It doesn't give you any indication around how vulnerability management is being handled within a given organization or for a particular software application or product or service. It represents a baseline of activities that, quite honestly, most people should be performing at this point in time. If we walk towards an SBOM, the SBOM also isn't able to answer those types of questions. It's simply providing you with an indication as to what the software is that's in there, potentially through vulnerability disclosures, whether or not there are any unpatched CVEs that might be important to mitigate within the system. But they themselves don't necessarily give you a full confidence that the software assurance practices within the supplier align with what your expectations might be. So if we take a look at one philosophy, you do have a self-attestation form. So if you've been able to go and produce this without the need for a POAM, you should get credit for this activity. Similarly, if you have produced an SBOM, you should get credit for that activity. And that is one of the core elements that we have within the acquisition guide within our governance section. For what you have performed as a result of another action, maybe receiving a FedRAMP authorization, that is worth something, and that effort should be reflected accordingly.
Good. Quite frankly, the software acquisition guide picks up all these things because you touched on those things. Each of them very necessary, but by themselves not sufficient. A software bill of materials, good example. It's not the silver bullet, but it's a red flag if a supplier does not provide you an SBOM, as an example. So it's all the things together. So Sridhar, why don't we get into some of the details about the governance questions? We'll go to the next. Yeah, thank you for the slide. that we have this broken out, and the governance questions are kind of key there. Those 19 governance and attestation questions that we ask about suppliers. Could you go through that and why that's important? And then Dick, I'll ask you to follow up with it as well.
Yeah. So the governance questions, basically was created to serve two purposes. One is to navigate whoever is the respondent to navigate his or her way around the guide to the rest of the control questions. So it's written in a conditional manner. So once you answer certain governance questions, yes or no, depending on that, you will not have to answer the rest of the questions in another section. So that's how it's organized. It's primarily to provide the navigation that's necessary for an exhaustive guide such as this one, which is probing multiple different domains with regard to the security practices. And two, to reduce the fatigue that one would have in terms of confronting oneself with this many questions to answer, regardless of whether it's a procurement deal or whether it's a prospective bidding or whatever it is. But eventually you end up with, hey, I have to answer this many questions. It's kind of making me tired. So the governance questions actually streamlines the amount of time you would spend or the overall burden that you have to put in terms of responding to these questions. So it is inclusive of all the controls. You would see the other sections at the same time organized in such a way that it just provides a way for you to conditionally skip certain questions in the rest of the sections.
That's good. So Dick, you're the first one who went through this to say, how much time would it take me to fill out this worksheet, answering the questions? So you started with the supplier governance and attestation questions, and you were able to go through and maybe have to pick up some of the other ones. So kind of give us your perspectives and then walk us through how to use the guide and the accompanying spreadsheets.
Happy to do it, Joe. So I would have to say, I think, following the words of suggestion or analogy that Kenitra Tyler provided, the spreadsheet is kind of like our version of what's it, the tax returns. I forget, no, TurboTax.
TurboTax.
You described it as, but yeah, that's true. And I looked at it from the perspective of a small software producer. So as I was looking at it that way, I was also thinking about my own customers. They are attempting to identify cyber risk before they buy a product and before they install a product. So I was really looking at both sides of the coin here as a supplier and as a consumer. And what I found was that the spreadsheet and the guide itself is really very practical from both perspectives in terms of providing the guidance you need to build secure by design products and to verify secure by design products. And I think of our guide as a sort of a Cliff's Notes for that Venn diagram, which is over 1,000 pages of material. We're sort of the Cliff Notes. It gives you the shortcuts. It says, here are the things you really need to know. So that's how I view it, Joe. Thanks.
Okay. And then if you walk through some of these, you've got some slides that give some more details here about you were filling it out.
I do, and I'm happy to go through that with you now in some level of detail. So what you're looking at on the screen now is essentially a screenshot of what's in the spreadsheet. And this document is available primarily to give consumers or software consumers the ability to communicate with their vendors and express to them what they're interested in, or you might call secure by demand, with regard to the products that they provide. And so this particular section is really showing us what the 5 different control areas or categories are. And I tell my customers, you really don't need to have all of the information for all of the tabs. You really, in order to really get a sense for where a product vendor is coming down with regard to secure by design. If you ask a vendor to simply answer the governance questions, of which there are 19, you will get a very good sense for where that vendor stands with regard to their commitment to secure by design. And I have to say that this is really a global phenomenon, this whole secure by design and secure by demand. If you look at the EU Cyber Resilience Act, it's right in there as a requirement to be secure by design and secure by default. And I work a lot with the energy industry, and there are two regulators out now looking to understand better what the industry is doing with regard to supply chain risk management. So my recommendations to them have been to use this spreadsheet, have the vendor, have the consumer entities, the critical infrastructure operators send this document, this spreadsheet to their vendors, and ask them to answer at a minimum the governance tab, the 19 questions. Next slide, please.
Before you move on to that, he's got the point on there. A web tool is being designed by currently CISA's National Risk Management Center that takes all this material and it gives you a web tool to better do that. And we've already looked at some of the initial work with it. It'll be available. We don't have a date yet, but the point is it's being developed so that people can more easily go through this.
Thank you, Joe. You've been covering my back the whole time in this thing. So thank you again, sir. Next slide. So this shows you what that document looks like. And as I said, it's kind of analogous to TurboTax, where each governance, control area, in this case governance, has a control question, which you answer yes or no to. And it essentially sets the stage for what you need to, what you need to answer in the subsequent sections. So if you answer yes, for example, to this first question about submitting an attestation form, well, that form covers an awful lot of territory, not all of it, but a lot of the development related materials. And so if you answer that one with a yes, many of the development categories are skipped. And so the guide goes on and continues with this yes-no framework. And what you'll find is that the control questions are sort of the high-level requirement for a specific item. And we supplement those control questions with more detailed task questions. So if a party is really not sure whether to answer yes or no, or they're not really sure what it covers, we give them the task questions that provide that more granular level of detail.
Yeah.
And so that's what you see here is that these questions are answered and the trickle-down effect that takes place in the subsequent sections. Next slide, please. So this is where we talk about, the intersection of secure by design and secure by demand, and I'll add secure by default as well. And really, what does secure by demand mean? It's really what consumers should be expecting from their vendors. And that's the secure by demand aspect, is knowing what to ask those vendors for in terms of meeting your particular cybersecurity expectations. And the spreadsheet itself goes into some pretty significant detail on the various practices. And these are real practices. These are things I know I looked at when I was doing this work that Joe was describing, and asking the question, can I, as a software developer and a software producer, answer this honestly, and then, provide any additional details if necessary using something like a POAM, which I'll rely on Joe to tell me about. He knows those acronyms better than I do from the government. But at any rate, it is indeed intended to give the consumers the protection they need. And that's really what secure by design is really all about, is protecting those consumers, protecting them by having the vendors, the software suppliers and producers taking ownership of the processes and practices that are intended to keep those consumers safe. And so the goal is, don't release a product with vulnerabilities, because you're just introducing risk to your consumers. And always be available and accountable to those consumers so that your products, if they do indeed encounter a situation or a risk, that they are properly handled with vulnerability disclosure reporting as an example, and providing patches and updates as needed to address those risks. And so what you'll see down the very bottom here is CISA has given us a link to the Secure by Design pledge. And as of yesterday, or a couple of days ago, there were 243 parties who had signed that pledge. And it's lots of different, I mean, everyone from IBM to Microsoft to HP and Intel and a lot of other entities who say they're willing to commit to meeting those secure by design visions and goals of protecting the consumer from harm. And that's what those parties are committing to, is to provide that level of secure and reliable and trustworthy product to consumers.
Thanks a lot, Dick. I appreciate that. And oh, by the way, for everyone, you notice that Rachel from Boeing went in and explained POAM, Plan of Action and Milestones. So it's got, but by the way, and this is where you can use the worksheet that goes with it as you're filling it out. And if you have to answer no to some of those items because you says we're not doing that now, we're only doing it partially, it's an excellent way for building the POAM so that you can go back within your organization, say, hey, are we doing this and I was unaware of it? Or where is it? Can we better document this? Or do we need to actually do something differently? And so it's a great way of internally communicating within an organization using this guide to build POAMs. So Tim, adding on to this whole thing, the relationship of the acquisition guide and secure by demand in particular, because CISA came out with secured by demand almost as soon as they were working out at the same time. There's some overlap, there's relationships.
They were looking over your shoulder, Joe.
Well, but I mean, there's certain details in it that are different. Can you discuss some of the differences? How do you use these together?
Sure
Joe,
thing.
briefly before we do that, could I just add one thing, Joe?
Okay.
You mentioned earlier, and I'll just repeat it, that CISA is working on a web-based tool as a replacement for the spreadsheet. So just wanted to mention that. Thanks.
Add them together, right? Thanks.
Cool. So if we look at the way software has historically been created, feature and function have had priority and precedence over security. And if you're looking at when to put an investment into whether or not this particular piece of software is or isn't secure for its intended purpose, the sooner that you have that in the design cycle and the overall software development cycle, the better the outcomes are going to be. Time and time again, we've proven as industries that bolting security on after the fact is difficult at best. And so with secure by design, the ultimate goal is to recognize that companies should be responsible for the stuff that they ship, and that security is a key component of that responsibility and accountability element. Secure by demand now goes one step further and says, when making a decision, procurement, purchasing action, if security isn't part of that questionnaire, that set of criteria that is ultimately going to result in a successful acquisition, award, what have you, then you're missing an opportunity. And this is one of the big reasons why, from the software acquisition guide perspective, we want to have essentially a set of relationships between the types of governance questions that we're asking, the set of control groups, and then if you look at the spreadsheet or the document, you'll see that there are associated set of actions. So that now when you say, yes, I'm doing, I have my attestation form, I'm going to answer yes to that. We skip over the ones that the control questions and tasks that are associated with that activity. If you have a question around what does that governance question mean? In Appendix B, we detail the rationale for each of those questions. If there's a set of activities that may be being performed but might be inconsistent, you can now look and draw a line of sight into the control groups and then into the subsequent tasks to say, am I doing this? Is this part of the overall philosophy that we have for this particular software deliverable? And effectively, this now becomes a scenario by which the simple yes, no responses that we can acquire through the acquisition guide gives the acquisition teams, who are not necessarily technically versed in all of the capabilities or risks that might be associated with a particular piece of software, an opportunity to be part of the demand solution and then facilitate any types of communication between the risk owners and the actual suppliers.
So it's a good point with it, and I'm going to add a little advertisement on Secure by Demand when they came out. It's a much shorter document, but they brought up some key things that I definitely want to foot stomp. They actually asked, beyond asking for an SBOM, they also asked the question of you asking your suppliers about the CWEs. In our document, we talk about the known exploitable vulnerabilities based on CVEs. We do discuss CWEs, but Secure by Demand, their document actually gets into the common weakness enumeration. Being on the board for that, I would still say it's very important because CWEs represent the root causes of things that get exploited, meaning as long as you've got that, expect future CVEs to be generated from that. So I thought that was a nice difference, but there's not a completely overlap. There's just a lot of complementary activity between Secure by Demand and the software acquisition guide. There's also other things that are coming out. And so I'd like all the panelists to be able to comment on that. I'll start off with John, but then everybody to comment. So we've got Secure by Demand. We've got now the due diligence assessment quick start guide that's come out. So things are coming out. And we know that the federal acquisition regulations are going to be changed to be more explicit about this. And that's why we'll have a future version of our document here. So John, could you talk about some of your perspectives about the importance of the due diligence assessment quick start guide, even relative to what we're doing in our acquisition guide?
Absolutely. And Joe's absolutely right. We are expecting to see continued progressive steps toward trying to better secure the government, the enterprise industry. Each step is we're learning. Some of what we're learning is from the bad guys. They're out there. They're taking advantage of vulnerabilities. They're exploiting weaknesses. They are trying to be creative in how they are finding ways to affect either the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information that's out there. And each time that we see that, not only do we need to use lessons learned to figure out what it is that we need to fix for that, but it also opens our eyes to other thoughts and perceptions, and we can put the black hat, red hat, green hat, whatever hat you want to put on, you can go at and look at from a standpoint of what is it that we can do next to better secure what it is that we're trying to secure. So the due diligence assessment start guide that was just published is, if you look on the diagram, it kind of points out that it is really a subset of what is in 800-161. It is focused very specifically on doing due diligence assessments. There's obvious overlap between that and the software acquisition guide, but there are a lot of things that each of those two different documents cover that the other does not. So there is a relationship, but it's not a pure overlap. Each of those has their own place. Just like 800-161 Rev 1 recently had an update published here in the last week or two. That document, again, it covers a lot of things that the software acquisition guide is not focused on, and vice versa. So it is helpful when you have guides like the software acquisition guide out there that really help you focus in on some of the important things, but letting you dive a little bit deeper into understanding those specific aspects of the overall cybersecurity ecosystem.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I'm going to ask others to comment on it as well. Again, from my perspective, the best value that the software acquisition guide brings to the acquisition procurement community is more details in doing your due diligence to truly make a risk-informed decision. It gives you that kind of things. And on the other side, for the supplier, in addressing that to your potential customers, that says, we've exercised due care by following these practices that are documented through the different things. So that's a relationship. Again, as John pointed out, many things are evolving. Like other panelists here to talk about that, including Dick, you brought up what's happening in the EU. We know that it's getting to be a lot stronger. In the EU, they're getting to be even stronger than what we are in the US here. So again, open that up to everyone here. What's your comments about this and the relationship of other things that are going in that affect the acquisition activities?
Yeah.
So
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Tim.
no, go ahead, Sridhar.
Yeah, so the 161, if you're very familiar with the NIST SB 800 161, it covers a lot of ground. And we know that because of the sense that it's not only a procurement point decision, but it can help you to overall assess the security in the supply chain ecosystem at any point of your, post-acquisition versus pre-acquisition and things like that. So whereas the due diligence guide is primarily written, there are two distinct phases in procurement: before procurement, after procurement. The secure by demand guide was primarily pitched in what intelligent questions that one should ask after procurement is done, decisions are made. Whereas the due diligence guide, before even you execute the procurement decision, what due diligence you need to apply. So it's a derivative guide coming from 161, and it's not exactly the same what we did in software acquisition guide. The software acquisition guide, as you saw in the Venn diagram, covers more ground in terms of having all the controls mapped out of, the important controls that are necessary for making a procurement decisions, both from 161 point of view as well as 218. And beyond that, we also added a FedRAMP related controls as well, and 853 as well.
Right. And we did go even beyond those because we're aware of the fact that artificial intelligence is now being used in tools to generate software. And so we've asked some questions related to that, and they'll be enhanced once we come out with version 2 as well there. So John or Dick, do you want to add anything else on that?
So I want to just jump in for a second, Joe. So for the government enterprise scenario, we have a very, very good guide here, but it has applicability beyond just the government enterprise. This can be applied at the state and local level. We did have participation from entities in that realm. If you have a global responsibility, if you are part of a global multinational business, it is very straightforward to take the governance questions, reframe them in a way that makes sense for your particular environment, and still retain the control groups and the task activities, because those are common threads that you can apply in almost any cybersecurity related regulation or legislative act that's happening or coming forth, such as the European Union Cyber Resilience Act and others that are out there. So the acquisition guide, in terms of its core content, has broad applicability. It's simply a matter of when can I use it, and do I actually need any additional detail beyond a simple yes, no answer in order to accomplish this particular discovery exercise?
And I agree. The yes, no gets you started on that. And if a acquiring organization is truly more interested in it, it's a way of starting the conversation. It says you've generated an SBOM. All right, tell me more about that. Maybe you need more information supplied, because not all SBOMs are created equal. Just as an example with that. Dick or John, you have anything else to add in there?
Joe, I'll just say, it's already been covered here. I think John said it earlier as well. This is really a global phenomenon. Secure by design is catching fire in a lot of different areas. Australia has now announced intentions to have a framework. As you know, the EU CRA just went into the European Journal just recently. And the regulations we're seeing coming out of government, namely the ones I've seen anyways, are clear indications that people are indeed taking this very seriously. But as was said earlier, it doesn't cover every aspect of cyber risk because our marching orders were to focus on the attestation guide. And the attestation guide doesn't go into things like FOCI or foreign influence and control and ownership. So it is indeed the case that this is really very specific to secure by design practices, as opposed to the whole kit and caboodle of, software risk assessments that you find in SB 800-161.
Right. Now, we didn't ask the question explicitly about foreign ownership, control, or influence. We did ask a question in there about, do you require background checks of people at the supplier side that are consistent with the environment of the government side where they're needing it? So we tried to soften that, but maybe we could use more explicit examples in there as well. What we're gonna do based on the time where we're at, we're gonna do the quick, where are we going? Meaning version 2 is coming out and other things to come with it. And then I'm gonna go to some of the questions that are in the chat. So Tim, I'm gonna have you lead off on that. What do you see version 2 being like?
So version 2 is something that we've been speaking about for the better part of the last year. And we had 2 release criteria for the acquisition guide. The first was we needed to have the self-attestation form finalized so that we could ensure that the mappings were correct. That happened. We published in August. The next logical inflection point, the FAR language. Once that FAR language is published, then we do very much anticipate a second revision of this that incorporates whatever is part of that FAR language. We do see that this is not a static environment. Things like the evolution of AI and large language models and other compute-intensive forms of software are going to be moving forward. We today have one control question around AI. Wouldn't surprise me if we expanded upon that. Having the due diligence assessment guide, there may be activities that are reflected in there that bear inclusion. So this is very much, think of it more as a living document than a one and done.
Right. And as we mentioned, there is going to be a web tool coming out soon, but it may be a nice packaged gift for you. It'll be out there soon. There was a question that was asked in here that, and I'm going to have Dick answer it in more detail about it. It says, do you think that and this comes from Jeff Walker, do you think suppliers will just make a completed questionnaire publicly available on their website or some other way? And from my perspective, yes, they can, but there is another way. It's called the RSAA. Dick, could you comment on that? How would somebody use a completed the spreadsheet? Where would they post that, and how would that be done on? And what is RSAA? Why is that being used?
Oh, happy to do it, Joe. Yeah, I would. My recommendation is not to publicly post your questionnaire responses or your attestations. I think that's something you should really maintain in a confidential state. The CISA organization has created a portal for entities to upload their materials for government agencies to perform a risk assessment. And if you look at many organizations like GSA now requires products to be considered or evaluated for trustworthiness. So the RSAA portal would be the place I would recommend you submit your attestations, your SBOMs, and your responses to your questionnaire as well, so that government agencies can use that material during their risk assessment.
And so that's the CISA RSAA, and that stands for?
Oh, you're gonna put me on the spot here, Eskel.
Repository for software attestation and artifacts.
Okay, and artifacts. That's what the other A is. Thank you.
Thank you, Sridhar. Another one was at my back throughout this whole thing.
Here's a point and this is true of many even for SBOMs. It's about telling potential buyers that says, we do these things. We have these artifacts. We're not going to put it out on our website where anyone else can explore it, but we're posting it here to make it available to our potential customers. That's what's good about this, to be able to go with that. Oh, and you have the link in there from Charles about the RSAA as far as the resources that are available. Again, it's a great place to post things and tell your customers, saying, go here. They've got access to it. They're in the federal government. And to do that. What we're going to do is we've got about 2 minutes left here. And there have been questions about, let's see, is anyone, let's see. about guidance with H-bombs. So the ICT SCRM task force has already put out guidance on the use of hardware bill of materials. It's not explicitly covered on our software acquisition guide. I will tell you that NIST has also come out with new guidance on hardware common weaknesses. There's evolving document in here, but right now there's not acquisition guidance for H-bombs, but don't be surprised to see that coming out. And so that's any other, let's see. We were asked, can we share the slides? And the slides are going to be posted. In fact, this entire webinar will be posted on the CISA website. So you'll be able to get that.
And Joe, there is a link in there about the user guide for RSAA. I will tell you, don't even try to do it. It's not intuitive. Make sure you get that user's guide so you'll know how to use that RSAA portal, because it's definitely not intuitive.
Okay. And with that, coming close to the end of the hour here, I'd like to return control of this to AD Harrington. I want to thank you and your team. The National Risk Management Center has been very helpful in doing this. You're providing a community resource, and you're continuing to work on that and collaborate with our community. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe, for leading today's insightful discussion on the software acquisition guide and the accompanying spreadsheet. I'd also like to offer a special thanks to Tim, John, Sridhar, and Dick for their expertise and commitment over the last 2 years in developing this incredible and essential resource. It's been really wonderful to sit and listen to this webinar. I learned a lot about the product's features and the value it provides, and I really hope the audience found it equally beneficial. On a personal note, I got a really deep appreciation for the guide's development process as well, especially the integration of pivotal resources like NIST and FedRAMP and the Secure Software Development Attestation Form, and including these foundational resources like truly elevates the guide's credibility and reliability. And it's just fantastic to see key information consolidated into one comprehensive source. So you guys did an incredible job. This clearly simplifies the acquisition process and really just promotes consistent and secure practices across the board. So I appreciate everyone who joined us today. For those who did not, again, this will be recorded and posted so you can tune in. And, we look forward to offering, obviously, additional webinars on the guide early next year. So try and keep an eye out for invitations. In the meantime, I encourage you to explore the task force's website for more information on the software acquisition guide and other valuable resources to strengthen your organization's supply chain resilience. On another note, slightly pivoting here, also excited to share, I believe Joe mentioned this, the task force will soon be releasing a new report on AI-related threats to the ICT supply chain, which we'll discuss in the upcoming webinar. So be sure to check the website, follow us as a social media to stay updated. And finally, we greatly appreciate if you could take a moment to complete a quick survey on the website to provide your feedback on the guide and the spreadsheet. And thank you again for your time. Have a wonderful afternoon.